Well, hello, guys. It's David Vose time again, and it's a beautiful day in paradise on Red Mesa, New Mexico, out here on the old uh, homestead. Few clouds in the sky, and it's a little windy. Not too bad. It's just about right. Been doing some gardening, getting ready to plant a bunch of stuff. I'm really thinking I'm going to order some wisteria, and it's like an invasive plant, which is what I want because I live out here in the desert. So this plant will survive winters and summers and heat and cold and hard clay soil and all the kinds of things. But I got some ideas I'd probably tell you about soil. I'm learning a lot about gardening and soil, and we'll talk about that here someday because it's very important. It's very interesting. But I hope you're having a wonderful day, guys. I want to get right into it today. Oh, buddy, we're going to talk about things that you probably never heard before, and things that, once you hear them and you see it, you're like, well, shouldn't we have known that? I mean, this is stuff that people just don't know about our founding, this country, and, uh, you know, it's just some mind boggling information. And to start off, we're going to talk about John Hancock and his signature, and, George Washington, and some other individuals like, get this, one of the original founding fathers and one of the original presidents of the 13th president of the Continental Congress. So, yeah, probably just about one of the first founding fathers, along with Hancock, who was also a president of the Continental Constitution. But this 13th president, his name was Arthur St. Clair. Now, that may throw up a little, like, what for you? Because we've been talking about St. Clair, otherwise spelled Sinclair, that was a direct line, one of the direct lines or bloodlines of Jesus Christ. And we're going to show you, and we're going to see if we got any evidence that he indeed was a direct descendant of Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene, one of the founding fathers who was also one of the presidents, basically the first president of this country. Really going to get interesting today, friends. So stay tuned. Well, let's get right into it. Let me show you this. I asked AI what was the symbol under John Hancock's signature. And AI says, it's great you're looking closely at John Hancock's signature. There isn't a specific symbol under his signature on the Declaration of Independence, but there are some interesting flourishes that could be mistaken for a symbol. Let's clarify. Almost sounds like they're being more careful because I asked them about the symbol on the Watchtower magazine the other day, and we got into a big argument because they said they denied it. This time they're like not denying it; they're just saying, "Oh, how sweet that you're looking so carefully. Oh well, let's go over this and clarify. It's not really a symbol, but okay. So what is it? Well, notice. Let me show you. I think that's a symbol. I mean, I know it may be a little flourishy, but it's very uniform, and there's specifically a circle with a line going through it, perpendicular, and then at an angle are two straight lines, which I don't know, but I think that could be a symbol, and I'm going to look into it. But they say no designated symbol. There's no official symbol placed beneath Hancock's signature on the Declaration. What you might be noticing are decorative swirls or flourishes he added to his signature. Flourishes as a style element. Hancock was known for his flamboyant and stylish signature. So these embellishments were simply part of his personal style. These flourishes are more like ornate calligraphy rather than a specific symbol with a deeper meaning. What crossed my mind when I was reading this up to this point is that they're very certain it's not a symbol. And they're also very certain that it's a flourish. and ornate calligraphy. But I don't know how they could be certain unless somebody said that. And they don't post a quote here that says, "Oh yeah, I'm not making a symbol. I'm just doing calligraphy." And even if there was somewhere we could see some evidence that he was known for the calligraphy in different styles and flamboyant calligraphy, they should have added that, but they didn't. It says no hidden codes. There's no evidence to suggest Hancock intended these decorative elements as a secret code or hidden symbol. In summary, instead of a specific symbol, Hancock's signature features decorative flourishes that add to his grandeur and make it stand out. These elements were part of his distinctive handwriting style and didn't represent a hidden message or symbol. Did you know that John Hancock was the president of the Continental Congress? Does that make him like Speaker of the House or the President of the United States, which maybe at that point they didn't call it the United States per se. But you might say that John Hancock was actually the president before Washington. So I wanted to understand. I just had this feeling, I do have this feeling, that there's something traditional about this signature or the calligraphy underneath his name. That it wasn't just him on the spur of the moment going, whee, whee, making something up. Because specifically in this little symbol below his name, and by the way, the reason it was so big, and most people don't know this, is because he was the first one to sign, because he was the Continental President. He was the president of the Continental Congress. So he was the first one and basically initiated the signing. He was the leader. His name would be bigger, and then the others would file up and they would sign under his name. And, they didn't presume to be the chief person there, so they put their names smaller because they all had to sign. So that's perfectly normal. But under his name, he makes this very flowing little symbol, like a circle with two lines going down diagonally and one going across. So if you look it up, then AI says it doesn't mean anything. It's just, he's just flowing with his writing and just got carried away. But notice that I look up a list of Masonic abbreviations. Look at that official document. This is how they signed official documents. They used this circle around something to draw your attention to it. Like, his name is on the top. There's no circle around that. But underneath the name, there is this letters or something, and then there's a circle around it. Now, it's interesting that the circle that is under Hancock's name has an H in it, and it may very well indicate that it has something to do with Hancock, H for Hancock, because if you look at the angle that he puts it, it's the same angle that he puts the H in his Hancock. It's at the same angle. So it almost looks like he's saying, okay, this is H for Hancock, and he circles it. Well, why would he sign his name and then sign his name again, symbolically? Well, the Masons use the word H for holy a lot. And of course, you've also got the cross there. But here is official documents being assigned this way, as you can see right here. Right? So I'm convinced that there's a meaning to this symbology. And you see, whatever the meaning, we know that these individuals were Masons. They were of an order not infiltrated by the Illuminati like today, but of the original Huguenot French order from Mary Magdalene. They put that in all the architecture and everything they did, indicating that they were here as descendants of Mary Magdalene, and in the order of the Knights of St. John. Now, I'll read you what they used to write and symbols that they used to make, which had to do with John the Baptist and John the Evangelist, which I believe is really the same person. It's just that that's gotten lost in the translation, because that's, I think, why he's called John the Presbyter or John the Elder, because he's not the Apostle John, which died early. But John the Presbyter was John the Elder, meaning there were two Johns, and John the Elder was John the Baptist. Now, it's no secret that the Knights of St. John was all about John the Baptist. Even the Skull and Bones today isn't about death and evil, but it's about the skull of John the Baptist, who was beheaded. So there's a lot, and we're not going to go into all of it here because we don't have the time today. But I'm only pointing out to all these little things that we can just ponder that makes it clear that this is some kind of Masonic symbolism that Hancock is using. And it looks like an H, it looks like a cross, and it's circled. To bring your attention to that with some kind of calligraphy or something. Notice that on this one, there is, in the circle, there are 3 dots at the end. I'm not sure even what that name is that's being written there. But at the end of the name, within the circle, are 3 dots. And see, this is very significant because it says the 3 dots, traditionally known as the tripunctual abbreviation or triple dot, is a symbol used all over the world in Freemasonry for abbreviations, signatures, symbolic representation. And the dots are typically arranged in a triangular pattern, carry multiple layers of meaning within Masonic tradition. The triple dot is used for Masonic abbreviations. Any non-Masonic abbreviations must be written with a simple dot. As an example, a date on a Masonic document could be written 60204 A 3 dots L 3 dots, you see. But if it's non-Masonic, it would just be 1 dot. Therefore, the sign is encoded in Unicode. And many processing programs, therefore, can be created by typing la 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 la, which I don't understand all this other mumbo jumbo. But what we gather from this is that there's something very highly symbolic about John Hancock's symbol. And even if we don't know fully exactly what it means, we know beyond a doubt it comes from the Freemason tradition. And it has to do with becoming free and establishing freedom. And that was the whole point of the order, to protect Mary and her children. So you find in the second epistle of John, chapter 1, verse 1, to the chosen lady and her children. Now, the chosen lady, who is that? Because that doesn't just mean lady. That means like Martha, or which is Mary, or which is a title that means Lord, and it's like Madame, Milady. You see, it's a today it just sounds like, oh, they're just being silly, Madame, But that was a royal title, and her children. Now, who would that be? Well, it's the church. You see. So the whole point was to protect the Holy Grail, or the Holy Blood. John was knighted to do that. And it wasn't just to protect Mary, but it was to protect all of her seed. The blood of Christ that then would go forward and come down to a time when they would come to a place where they would become free according to prophecy and build the New Jerusalem. So I just want to read this briefly about the circle. often represents the boundary of a Mason's duty to deity and their brethren, or the line between their passions and those around them. It can also symbolize the universe or the lodge itself, like the brotherhood, you see, with the point at the center representing the great architect of the universe. The vertical line divides the circle, creating the upper and lower halves. This line can be seen as representing the boundary between the known and the unknown, the material and the spiritual, or the past and the future. Two parallel diagonal lines often represents the two patron saints of Freemasonry, St. John the Baptist and St. John the Evangelist, which like I said, I believe the truth about that is that it's two aspects of the same person. They can also symbolize the two grand parallels of Moses and Solomon, or the summer and the winter solstices, because the circle would be the astrological wheel. So all of these things represent these things. The point within the circle represents the focus, the core of Freemasonry, the great architect of the universe. It can also symbolize the center of the lodge, the sacred altar, or the heart of a Mason's moral compass. So, duty to deity and brethren and the great architect. The context of the Knights Templar, while the point within a circle is prominent Masonic symbol, the Knights Templar as a distinct Masonic order have their own specific emblems and symbols. The Knights Templar often use a cross and crown, or a cross patee, with in hoc signo vinces. In this sign you shall conquer, resting on the swords in Saltar. Now it's interesting too, we were talking about that the other day. The Knights Templar symbol, even though AI didn't want to admit it the other day, if you guys have watched that, you'll know what I'm talking about, where I had the knockdown drag out with AI over this. But the in hoc signo vinces, with the cross and the crown, literally has two swords crossed within a circle. And then a cross and a crown. So that's exactly what the Watchtower has, the two swords crossed over a knight symbol, which represents the Knights Templar going back to the order of St. John and Mary Magdalene. So, just a few details. We don't know exactly what he was trying to convey by that symbol under his name, but we do know it had to do with Masonic tradition and the Knights of St. John, and the establishing of this country and a place of freedom for all the children of Mary Magdalene, and of course Jesus Christ. But get this. They say John Hancock was not the President of the United States in the modern sense. He was President of the Continental Congress before the U.S. Constitution and the office of the President of the United States were established. President of the Continental Congress, Hancock held this position from 1775 to 1776. Well, there were other presidents of the Continental Congress before 1775, so he wouldn't even be the first president of the Continental Congress, but this was a leadership role. And by the way, Hancock was a name affiliated with the early Mormons, as well as some of the other signers of the Continental, or members of Continental Congress, which one was a Smith, and had some direct relationship with Joseph Smith's family. And the president of Yale University was Smith, and they were involved in archaeological information digging and finding treasure. If you look it up, they'll say, well, the Smith that ran Yale University, the president of Yale, he didn't have anything to do with Joseph Smith and his family. Well, they say there's no evidence. It might be, but they don't have any proof. But here's the thing. Joseph Smith's brother, Hiram, and his father actually and literally worked with that particular Smith that ran Yale University. They came from the same area, from New York, and they knew them and they worked there. Hiram went to the university himself, and they were involved in some kind of archaeological digging for the university, which is one of the reasons why Joseph Smith was interested in finding treasure. And they've blown it all out of proportion today and said that he was a treasure hunter or a digger, like he used sorcery to find treasure. But what they were looking for was real treasure. They were archaeological treasures. They were looking, I believe they knew that there were, well, for one, remember at that time people were trying to find the Templar treasure. And I don't know that Joseph Smith was literally trying to find the gold or the money, because there certainly was a lot of money that they claimed was hidden somewhere. But what he was looking for, and what's more important than that money, is the treasure. There must have been like the Ark of the Covenant and who knows what kind of things that was supposed to have been hidden. Joseph Smith said there were other things in this stash other than the golden plates, but that's all he was allowed to take out. So that's interesting. But the first president of the United States was George Washington. Yeah, that's probably all we need to read there. But they say Peyton Randolph was the first president of the Continental Congress. He served from September 5th, 1774 to October 22nd, 1774, which was about a month. Randolph was a prominent Virginia politician and served as the Speaker of the Virginia House of Burgesses prior to becoming president of the Continental Congress. I asked how many Continental presidents we had, and was there a black president? Because there was something going around, and I did a video on it, where a lot of people are claiming that one of the Continental presidents was black. Well, so I asked how many, and was there a black one? And they say there were 14 presidents of the Continental Congress, serving between September 5th, 1774 and March 2nd, 1789. Now that's interesting, because we had a constitution in 1776. So there were, 13 years of having presidents other than Washington, like simultaneously? This is strange. But it says no black presidents. There were no African American presidents of the Continental Congress. The first African American to serve in the U.S. Congress was Hiram Rhodes Revels, who was elected to the Senate in 1870. But notice this. Here's the 14 presidents. Now, look at this. Peyton Randolph was number 1. Henry Middleton, South Carolina, number 2. Peyton Randolph from Virginia is number 3. So he served twice. And then John Hancock, who was from Massachusetts. Now remember, John Hancock signed the Constitution, right? So even after the Constitution was signed, they still hadn't, they didn't have a president, or what was going on here. So, after John Hancock, there was Henry Lawrence, John Jay, Samuel Huntington, Thomas McKean, John Hanson, Elias Boudinot, Thomas Mifflin, Richard Henry, Nathaniel Gorham, Arthur St. Clair, and Cyrus Griffin. Now, notice Arthur St. Clair. We've been talking about this particular bloodline of Jesus Christ. And they claim the principal bloodline of Jesus Christ that came down through the Capetian line and the Clair Vaux line. There were 2 lines, the line of the Vaux, which became sometimes Waldo or Valley in different languages as it came down. But when it went to England, it became Vaux. And when they came to America, they arrived in Boston, they changed their name to Vose. And that's one of the principal bloodlines of Jesus Christ and Mary. So the head of the Templars, who was called the Clair Vaux, was literally it was literally, I think, a title that he had the two bloodlines from Clair and Vaux. And of course, most people know the Clair line by the guy we call Sinclair. Sinclair came over on a boat and discovered America about the same time as Columbus, but Sinclair means Saint Clair. So it's not Sinclair, it's Clair, but he's a saint. So it's Saint Clair. So Clair is the bloodline. So the guy who was the second to the last continental president of the United States before it was the United States was Clair. So was this Arthur St. Clair related to St. Clair or Sinclair? So get a load of this. Arthur St. Clair, the 13th president of the Continental Congress, was a member of the Scottish clan Sinclair. He was a member of the Scottish clan Sinclair. I mean, it's just a different way of saying it or spelling it. He has the same name, but it went from Sinclair to St. Clair. Same word. He says, but there is no direct evidence. They didn't say it didn't exist. They just don't have the evidence at this point to suggest a close relationship. Now, again, notice the wording. There is a relationship, but not a close relationship, to the specific Sinclair family who are credited with discovering or settling Nova Scotia. Here's a more detailed explanation. Clan Sinclair, Arthur St. Clair, was part of the broader clan Sinclair. In other words, when they say a clan, that means a family. So he was a lineal descendant of this family. But we can't prove that he was the firstborn heir, is what they're saying. Or he may have been a cousin, but what determines a close relationship? Not a son or a grandson, but maybe a cousin or a nephew, perhaps. So, the Sinclair family was a prominent Scottish family with a long history. Sinclairs in Nova Scotia. Some members of the clan Sinclair did have ties to Nova Scotia, particularly through military service. And so he was probably directly related from St. Clair that came over, but we just don't know if he was a great-grandson or a nephew or an uncle or something. So I asked, was St. Clair a descendant of the lineage of the Sinclair, Clairvaux, or Merovingian line? They said there's no evidence to suggest that Arthur St. Clair, the president of the Continental Congress, was a descendant of the Sinclair family associated with either the Clairvaux Abbey or the Merovingian dynasty. Here's why. Clairvaux Abbey. Clairvaux Abbey was founded by St. Bernard in 1115 and was a prominent Cistercian monastery in France. While it's true that some Sinclairs were associated with religious orders, there's no documented link between Arthur St. Clair and the specific lineage connected to the Clairvaux Abbey. Merovingian dynasty. The Merovingian dynasty was a Frankish dynasty that ruled parts of present-day France and Germany from the 5th to the 8th centuries. There are claims of connections between the Sinclair family and the Merovingians, but these are largely based on legends and unsubstantiated theories, not solid historical evidence. Well, I counter that all we have, there is no absolute history, but what we have that really should substitute for history is legends, because that's what they're calling them. And the legends weren't just stories that were made up. They were legends, and they were written, whatever you call them, legends or whatever. That's the form that history was given to us. Not detailed history, but legends, which are all attributed to certain kind of, today we call them romance. But you see, that's gotten watered down because of the fact that today a romance novel is something that they think is fiction. But these may not have been fiction. Just like there are parables in the Bible, but the Bible is not fiction. The parables literally give you certain individuals and lineages. So that's not a parable, it's historical. Genesis chapter 10 gives you lineages. You know, yet Genesis chapter 1 is a parable that describes the creation. And yet, a few chapters later, there is literally a lineage of individuals. So, what we call legends are giving us lineages, even heraldry and certain names and legends that most of these legends come with heraldry, which is just like a last name. It indicates your forefathers. So this man has the name Clair, which right there, unless he was adopted or something, indicates his heritage. And the fact that the legends say that they came from the Merovingian line tells us that this is the case. So what we have here is that some of the members of the original governing body of the continental United States and America, the early founders of this country, were literally descendants, more than likely, at least part of the family that we can trace, the Sinclair family, that is traced back to the Merovingian line through the Carpathian line and the Vaux line, as we have shown on this channel many times. Peter Waldo, which was one way of spelling this word valley. They were the people of the valley, and the Albigenses were the people of the Alps. And the people of the valley is where all the cities were. And so they were like mayors or governors, and the family of Peter Waldo, he was the inheritor, the heir of that family, owned 169 cities, towns, and villages along the Rhone, up from Marseille, where Mary Magdalene landed. And they were Cathars, aka Templars. They had a Templar order in the Cathars. So some say, well, they're not the same. Well, no. The Cathars were all the people of the valley. But those who led the people were priests. And the word knight literally means a priest. And they were knighted or priested. They were ordained. And their tradition goes back to Mary Magdalene and Jesus Christ. And that particular line that came down through the Carpathian line, and then they began to call it the Waldo line, or Valdez, Peter Valdez, or as it is in the legends, Percy Val, because Val, Valley. And then when it got to the Old French, they dropped the sound of the L. They didn't pronounce that, so it was just, instead of Belois, it became voice. So it went from Belois to Vaux to Vose. But that name is one of the lines to the present day that can be traced back through legends and heraldry. And I have a book that was written on my family's name, which literally has the legend that we came from the dragon, which is the King Arthur whole legend about the Pendragon. And so Arthur Pendragon was the father of King Arthur. And it's interesting that this guy's name was Arthur St. Clair, because they often named their children over and over again after their firstborn son. They would call him from Arthur. So while I don't have absolute proof that Arthur St. Clair was a lineal descendant of Jesus Christ, and probably maybe the first president of this American, nation, one of the first presidents, and therefore you might wonder who the rest of these individuals were, that served as presidents before Washington, and Washington himself. You might wonder if these individuals don't somehow go back to this particular lineage or to this order of Templars who came here for the very purpose of establishing a free country in a New Jerusalem. So I asked, was Arthur St. Clair a Freemason or a Templar or a Knights of the Golden Circle? And they said, while there is evidence suggesting Arthur St. Clair was a Freemason, there is no evidence to suggest he was a Knights Templar or a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. Here's what the available information suggests. Freemason historical records indicate that Arthur St. Clair was a Freemason. His burial under a Masonic monument further supports this claim. Knights Templar. There is no documented evidence to support Arthur St. Clair being a member of the Knights Templar. Knights of the Golden Circle. The Knights of the Golden Circle was a secret society active during the American Civil War, well after the Arthur St. Clair's death in 1818. Therefore, it would be impossible for him to be a member. All right, well, that's interesting. So he was a Freemason. So I asked how many of the first 14 presidents of the Continental Congress were Freemasons or Templars. And they said determining the exact number of Freemasons among the first 14 presidents of the Continental Congress is difficult due to incomplete records. However, some were members of the fraternity. The known Freemasons were Peyton Randolph, the first president. Evidence suggests Peyton Randolph may have been a Freemason. Fourth president, John Hancock, was a prominent Freemason in Boston. See, Boston is right. It's the very city where the Vox line arrived, and then they changed their name to Vose. The Knights Templar. There is no evidence to suggest that any of the presidents of the Continental Congress were members of the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar was a Masonic order gained prominence later in the 19th century, well after the Continental Congress. So I asked what started the idea to form a Continental Congress. And it said the idea to form the first Congress was sparked by the British Parliament's passage of the Intolerable Act, also known as the Coercive Acts, in 1774. Here's a breakdown of the events that led to the Congress. The Boston Tea Party. Colonists, angered by the Tea Act, protested by dumping the tea into the Boston Harbor in December of 1773. The Intolerable Acts. In response to the Boston Tea Party, the Parliament passed a series of punitive measures aimed at Massachusetts, including the Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, the Administration of Justice Act, and the Quartering Act. Colonial outrage. These acts were seen as a direct attack on colonial liberties and self-governance, galvanizing the other colonies to support Massachusetts. Calls for unity. Colonial leaders, particularly in Massachusetts and Virginia, began to call for a unified response to the Intolerable Act, leading to the idea of a Continental Congress. The first Continental Congress delegates from 12 colonies, Georgia did not initially participate, met in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love? I wonder why they called it that. In September of 1774, to discuss their grievances and coordinate a response to the British policies. In essence, the Intolerable Acts were the catalyst that spurred the formation of the First Continental Congress by demonstrating the need for a unified colonial response to British oppression. AI further says that Arthur St. Clair was a supporter of the Patriot cause, was involved in various ways that contributed to the establishment of America, primarily through his military and political service. However, he wasn't directly involved in the initial planning and organization of the First Continental Congress. His military service in the Revolutionary War. He was an officer in the Continental Army. St. Clair served as a major general in the Continental Army, fighting for American independence. Aide-de-camp to George Washington. He was an aide-de-camp to George Washington demonstrating his close association with a key figure in the revolution. Committee of Safety. St. Clair served on his country's Committee of Safety, a local organization that played a role in coordinating resistance against the British policies. He was the president of the Continental Congress. He later served as the president of the Continental Congress, the governing body of the colonies during and after the war. Remember the term governing body. Jehovah's Witnesses use that term, and we've seen the connection that they have with Freemasons. So that is a Freemason term, governing body. And it is kind of like their way of saying the 12 apostles, which they kind of understood as the governing body of the Senate or the Sanhedrin that Jesus chose, the 72. So he was the governor of the Northwest Territory, appointed the first governor of the Northwest Territory, playing a crucial role in the westward expansion of the United States. He had close ties with George Washington. St. Clair enjoyed a close relationship with George Washington, evidenced by his service as Washington's aide-de-camp. As a delegate and later president, he was deeply involved with the Continental Congress, the body that declared independence and governed the nation during its early years. While some historical sources suggest that St. Clair was a Freemason, there is no conclusive evidence linking him to any specific secret society or fraternity that directly aimed to establish America. That's interesting. Here's a breakdown of their relationship. Early interactions. Their paths first crossed during the early stages of the war, when St. Clair, a brigadier general in the Continental Army, participated in the Battle of Trenton, a pivotal victory for the Continental Army. The Battle of Princeton. St. Clair is credited with suggesting the bold strategy that led to the American victory at the Battle of Princeton. He advised Washington to move the army to Princeton. He outmaneuvered the British and seized the town, a plan that proved successful. Command of Fort Ticonderoga. Impressed with his strategic capabilities, Washington later entrusted St. Clair with the command of Fort Ticonderoga, a crucial strategic location. However, St. Clair's controversial retreat from the fort during the Saratoga campaign led to his court-martial, although he was acquitted. Aide-de-camp. Despite the Ticonderoga incident, Washington retained a high opinion of St. Clair's abilities. After his acquittal, St. Clair served as the aide-de-camp to Washington for the remainder of the war. Shared challenges and victories. They served together through the hardships of the war, including the winter at Valley Forge, and witnessed the British surrender at Yorktown. Post-war collaboration. Their close association continued after the war, with Washington appointing St. Clair as the first governor of the Northwest Territory in 1788. St. Clair and Washington, a close association developed through their shared experiences in the Revolutionary War, marked by a strategic brilliance, moments of adversity, and ultimately mutual respect and collaboration. George Washington's father was Augustine Washington. Augustine Washington, 1694 to 1743, was a prominent planter in Westmoreland County, Virginia, served as a justice of the county court. He was the original owner of Mount Vernon. Augustine's first wife was Jane Butler, and they had 3 children before her death. He later married Mary Ball. I like that name, Mary Ball. I want to find out who she was, with whom he had 6 children, including George. Augustine's father was Lawrence Washington, 1659 to 1698, a politically active citizen of Westmoreland County who served in the Virginia House of Burgesses. Who else served in the House of Burgesses? In the Virginia House. And what is the House of Burgesses? Lawrence's father was John Washington, 1631 to 1677, an English immigrant who arrived in Virginia in 1657. John Washington was the great-grandfather of George Washington. So, let's take a look at the House of Burgesses and Mount Vernon. I think this is very important because when people study the history of the United States, they just go back to the Constitution and maybe they talk about the Continental Congress a little bit, but nobody realizes that this all began before that. And in one particular avenue that we can go down, it started with Virginia, which had the first kind of legislature, and they called it the House of Burgesses. And this is also where Thomas Jefferson lived, and Patrick Henry, who later became very influential in the United States and the Union. So, interestingly, Thomas Jefferson had Monticello, and George Washington, Mount Vernon, which also had a dome on it, he later put, and James Madison, who had Montpellier, which is the capital of the Languedoc in France, where Mary Magdalene originally arrived there in Marseille, just a few miles from Montpellier, and the capital of the Languedoc later became Montpellier. So these individuals that were coming over had something in mind in their ideas to, it wasn't just, like a lot of people think, yeah, right, they were trying to make a better world and a constitution of freedom and liberty and justice for all. It was just a big scam, right? These are the bad guys. They were slaveholders. They were, all this kind of thing. Uppity elite. Well, when they arrived, they were the first ones to, these individuals, these families that arrived, they certainly did have some authority, and they were certainly building up something that they believed would be the kingdom of the Lord on earth, a new Jerusalem. And they brought with them these ideas from the Languedoc, which is this whole idea of liberty. Liberty and fraternity came from France, friends. Yes, it did later in the 19th century become the wrong type of liberty, but that kind of liberty where they put a woman on the stage and burned all the Bibles and began to worship this prostitute, that's not the kind of French liberty that the Languedoc had. That kind of liberty was from Mother Mary Magdalene, and they honored the female, and they honored Mary and Jesus. They honored her very highly, and she wore the liberty cap, which is something that was taken by John, the presbyter. It had to do with the Tartarians, because John went to Ephesus with Mary, the Virgin Mother, and they went all over the place, and he protected her. So this liberty goes all the way back to John, the first of the knights, who was knighted to protect the Holy Grail. So liberty is all infused with this. And the liberty and the ideals of liberty was alongside the ideals of the Holy Roman Empire, which was not about liberty, but force and paper bulls and edicts and inquisitions, and all of this. While over in France, in the Languedoc, they were celebrating liberty and freedom and the spiritual esoteric wisdom that came down through that area. So when they got to America, remember, most of these were Huguenots, people from France that were thrown out of France. I mean, first the Waldensian Inquisition, then the Spanish Inquisition. Both of these were to get rid of these Sephardic Jewish people that can trace their bloodline back to Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene. And others, I mean, the French people, who became known or certainly honored the lineage back to Mary and Jesus. And so they certainly had Jewish blood in them. But they were Christians and followed Jesus. And they didn't follow the Torah or anything like that. But they were Sephardic Jews. They did study the esoteric wisdom and taught in these schools and understood these mysteries and were teaching them. So when they came here, the last Inquisition was the Huguenots, which were the same people, but years down the road later, after they'd pushed them out of France, and some of these Huguenots were taken to England and went to Scotland and different places, like Sinclair went to Scotland, and many of them went to England. And so they were dispersed and persecuted. So they were looking for a permanent home, and they came to America to establish a New Jerusalem. And in that group was this first area, Massachusetts, Boston, and Virginia. And they established the first legislature there, and it was called the House of Burgess, which is, according to this, it says the word came from the Middle English word burgess, meaning a citizen or a free man of a town or borough. See, right off the bat, when they got here and established the very first legislature, it had nothing to do with making laws to enslave mankind. It had to do with establishing freemen and freedom from the very get-go. And they brought with them the architecture, as James Madison and Montpelier would indicate, and Monticello, and also Mount Vernon, which also styled a dome. Yes, it had a lot of British architecture, but that's because Washington's family were Huguenots that ended up in the British Isles. So they carried with them a lot of British architecture, which also partly stemmed from the Languedoc and Monticello. If you look at the original mansion on Mount Vernon, it also has the portico and the dome and the various architectural styles that you might find at Monticello or Montpelier. And so these guys were related, and they lived in the same area. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Patrick Henry, and others. Some of the first of the founding fathers, and of course that's the first legislature. And they decided to call it the citizens of a freeman citizen, and to establish a Congress, not to establish laws, but to establish freedom and a constitution of liberty, to freedom from British rule. So it originates from the old French word burgess. So you see, this was something they brought from France, not from Britain, but it was from France. And they used this particular French word because they were hearkening back to Mary Magdalene. It meant a town dweller or a free man of a town. And within the House of Burgesses, the term specifically identified a person elected to represent a specific geographic area within the colony. They were representatives of the people, like we have today, a representative government. They made certain that they ratified that when they made the Constitution. It all stems from this, from George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and his very close associate, Arthur St. Clair, one of the first presidents of the Continental Constitution. They were elected officials, and they were usually landowners or prominent members of the local community. Now, today we would say, oh, they're into money, and they're landowners, and they're the elite. No, the elite were trying to rule over the land of America and tax them. They were trying to free themselves from taxes and having people rule over them. But obviously, when you've got all these people coming over, there are going to be individuals successful. You heard how the GOP today will talk about, oh, it's okay to be rich and stuff. That just means you're successful. Well, in the original meaning of that in the original times that George Washington lived in America in its early days, it did mean that you were just being successful and blessed. The Lord was blessing you to create a area where you had land and could prosper, and others would come and prosper, and they would have farms and ranches. And these farms and ranches wanted freedom and no taxation, and they wanted the opportunity for others to come, their brethren, other Huguenots, and other people that were persecuted and tired and lonely and hungry. Right? That's why they put the Statue of Liberty from France, by the way, out there in the in the ocean there as a beacon of freedom for all. And so their idea and their intent was to establish a governing body of people that represented the people, to make a militia. Remember, a militia is not an army to go and kill people and go across over there and wipe out the Iraqis, and then we'll go get the Libyans. No, these were people defending. That's all it was. A militia was something that if somebody came in to try and rape and pillage you, you would form a militia and go and defend the community on behalf of the community. So it wasn't about war and armies. It was about militias. And to this very day, it was actually written in the Constitution that we have the right to bear arms, and that has to do with militia. It doesn't have to do with, oh, I have the right to have a gun and protect myself from thieves. Well, maybe, partly, but mostly it was to have a gun to protect the community in the form of a militia. And so if you read the entire Constitution and the Bill of Rights and stuff, it was all about having the right of representation and to form militias to take down any tyranny that might heretofore occur. And at that time, they were talking about the world power or Britain, interfering with their freedom, and they were freemen. So it was citizen involvement in governance. And that's what our Constitution today is supposed to be about. Land owning. That's what it meant. Yeah, he was a landowner. He wanted everybody to be a landowner. And those people talk about slaves, and they don't understand what slavery was originally. If you didn't own anything, if you were destitute or you were in debt, even under the law of Moses, the only way you could become a slave is if you were in debt and you had to work off your debt. You weren't a free man because you owed somebody something. It was simply, people willingly went and worked for other people to pay off the debt. They made agreements. It was covenants. You didn't just take a slave. You made a covenant. Even a woman made a contract with a man that he would provide certain things and she would provide certain things. And then he would provide her with a child, which would be an heir. And the heir would give her, legitimacy and establish her right. You see? So there's a lot of things that we don't understand, or we're looking at it differently today. Of course, people then were still living in this rotten world because, like Christ said, not one jot or tittle will in any wise be abolished from the law until all things be fulfilled, and until heaven and earth pass away, and there will be a new heavens and a new earth. So as Christians, we're already following the laws of the new heavens and the new earth, forgiveness and love. And we would never, partake of owning. I mean, ultimately, the correct thing is that we don't own anything. And this is what Christ taught us, that we shouldn't own anything. So they hadn't really understood that this kingdom that they were trying to establish, whereby everyone would be a free man, because all debts would be wiped out. But you see, until the debt is wiped out, until every man forgives, you see, you're still, like the law says, an eye for an eye. So if you punch somebody's eye out, they got the right to punch your eye out. Unless the world or you willingly say, I forgive you. And those who willingly do that and begin to follow the new covenant, then the Lord himself will bless you, 100-fold. But you see, this is something that everybody has to choose. And so we'll get into that in another video, how this all works. But at that time, when they were coming over here from other countries, there were still many different people, and people who had nothing and were in debt and willingly needed someone to help them eat and give them something that they could pay off and work off this debt, that they also could become free. In a sense, that's what we're waiting for, the kingdom of Christ, which is the great Jubilee, when all men will be set free. So, yes, Joseph Smith was an abolitionist and didn't believe in slavery, and those who followed the true Christian ways would be that way. But at that time, it was just being established, this idea of freedom. And so there were still those who were destitute, and they didn't really know how to make the transition, but that's what needed to be done. And obviously it didn't happen, because certain greedy and evil men did not, go and forgive or love one another or give a cup of water under one of these little ones or whatever, but instead they demanded their tribute, and they began to eat and drink with the drunkards and beat their fellow servants. So we've got this apostasy, which is what we've got today. But we'll get into that at another time. This wasn't necessarily what people think it was. And this is why there's so much confusion, because once they had this idea of slavery here in America, and it got these tobacco farms and all these things going on, and then some of the people with a less respectable heart attitude began to become lords, you see, and they didn't want to let their slaves go free. They wanted to be landowners, but they didn't want other people to be. So it got corrupted. But that wasn't the original intent. In fact, that's why they made their legislation body of the burghers, to make a citizen involvement so that no one could ever take them over. So it says, landowning freemen of the boroughs chose their burgesses to represent their interests and make decisions on their behalf. So early American democracy, the House of Burgesses and its elected burgesses, were a critical step toward representative democracy in colonial America. They established the foundation for future elected legislative bodies. In summary, burgesses in the Virginia House of Burgesses were the elected representatives of the districts or boroughs within the colony. They represented the voice and the interests of the citizen in the legislative assembly. Very interesting. But anyway, we're over an hour. I'm going to go ahead and close this for today, guys. Certainly very interesting information, and wait till you see where we're going with all of this. We really want to understand, this country and what we're doing here and the times we're living in, and what is the truth in all of these subjects, and all this information that we're learning. Once you know the truth, or you have a foundation for your truth, then we can build on that foundation and really begin to understand. And so maybe tomorrow I want to talk about truth of a different kind. I mean, maybe more foundational, a little bit more spiritual. I want to share with you some things the Lord's been sharing with me about how and why we're kind of trapped in this delusion that we're in. And so this is a little bit more, maybe a little deeper information about how we can bring the kingdom of the Lord down to this earth. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. I really hope you have a wonderful evening. The Lord will bless you. Just seek Him and pray, and He's there if you need Him. He loves everybody, and He really is just waiting for you to seek Him, and He wants to bless you. His grace and His peace be with you. We'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a good one.